I was doing an event, a research conference for physicians in the Bahamas, and I had to get to Houston. And there was no flight from Nassau directly to Houston, which was, you could almost throw a stone. It's that close. I had to go through Atlanta. And then from Atlanta, I had to fly to Houston. And I kept telling Kelly, who books all my travel, that there's got to be a potential in the quantum field where I can fly directly there. And Kelly kept saying, you'd have to be really good for this one. In between all of this, I had several colleagues in the genre of what we do here, scientists and researchers, friends, kept telling me that I had to read this book. Especially, you have to read this book. You have to read this book. It's called Stealing Fire. I must have gotten 5 texts in one day, just with people that I trust and respect, to tell me to read this book. And so I picked the book up and I moved through this book called Stealing Fire in a very short amount of time, because it was really about the transcendental moment and all the different variations and ways how we can produce more peak flow and at the same time have a transcendental experience. And I was so excited about the book. I kept thinking to myself, boy, I would love to sit down and talk to this guy and show him some of the research that we have and show them what our brain scans have shown repeatedly as a pattern during that transcendental experience, in these high coherent patterns of gamma, the area around the pineal gland very activated, and an area of the brain that literally shows that the person's having a very positive experience that's producing a long-term memory. And how it happened, not in the neocortex, but happened more from the bottom up, more in the limbic brain and the brainstem, and how these patterns were a function of a change in brain waves and how it all kind of tied together. Anyway, a friend of mine called me up, actually sent me a text and said, hey, listen, I see you're going to be coming to Houston. Why don't I come and pick you up in my plane and take you directly to Houston? And I'm going to have Jamie Wheel on the flight and you guys could hang out, and we're going to stop in Bimini and we're going to swim with the dolphins on the way. And I thought, my God, that's so much better than going to Atlanta. Thank God that potential manifested in the field. And so Jamie is just so bright, so well researched, so diverse, so open-minded, so humble. And we sat down on the plane and we just hit it off immediately. And we talked for the whole flight from Nassau to Bimini, and then had a great time swimming out in the beautiful, beautiful sea there. And then we got back on the plane and we went at it again. And we opened our computers and exchanged information, and we really grew a lot from each other. And then somewhere in the last year, we went to Kelly Slater's surf camp where they have the perfect waves. And I brought my 2 sons, and Jimmy was there with his family and with a bunch of people, and we were celebrating a mutual friend's birthday. And we went down the rabbit hole on all kinds of things. And so his new book is called Recapture the Rapture. I've read the book in its entirety. There's so many great things that I want to talk about with Jamie, and there's so many relevant topics that's poignant to the times that we're living in today, with some really decent research, really great research to show there's ways for us to organize as a community and to really begin to make favorable changes in this world that we live in. And so those of you who haven't read Stealing Fire, by all means, I encourage you to read it. It's really a fabulous book, packed with so much good information. And Recapture the Rapture, I just finished, is so good, is so wonderful. And I wanted to bring Jamie on the call and introduce him to our community, because so many of the things that he talks about in this book, I think a successful culture, a successful community that thrives practices. And there's some of the things that I'm super proud of for us as a community that we seem to exemplify. And so I just wanted to take a moment and introduce you to Jamie Wheel, my dear friend. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us on this program.
Oh, thanks so much, Joe. And I did not know the beginnings of the story of Bimini, that you were so betwixt and between. So that makes the resolution of it and our first meeting all the sweeter, as well as getting to drink beautifully amazing bottles of wine that you then explain the entire nitric oxide benefit to at 35,000 feet. So that was an all-time great first meeting.
Yeah, and the book, Recapture the Rapture, I love the whole concept of nitric oxide and some of the effects in nitrous oxide as well, which is a sister molecule. It seems to have on the blood-brain barrier and transcendental moments as well. So I want to start off by just giving you an opportunity. We just had a few moments of discussion before we started. You know, one of the things that I really appreciate about the new way that we perceive things and we investigate things is through experience. And you're a deep thinker, and also you're very much a guy that's in his body, very much a guy who lives life fully, and you kind of step outside of convention, and you've had your profound experiences that were transcendental. And then similar to me, and we've had this conversation, we look for the science to be able to make it in a reductionistic way, to put the pieces together to make sense for people, not only just to accept it, but also entertain the possibility that it could happen to them as well. And we share that common interest, and because of your own willingness to be a pioneer and experience other realms, you've done such a great job. So I just wanted you to just kind of give an overview of why you decided to write the book, and especially during these times. And I want to give you an opportunity to kind of tease that out for our audience.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the simplest thing is a working description of my life. Like if I was going to write an autobiography, it would be like, are you kidding me? Because my entire life was sort of that of an accidental mystic. I came from a strictly materialist scientific household. My father was a military test pilot with a PhD in aeronautical engineering, and his job was to take the most lethal planes in the world and push them to their failing points and map it with differential calculus. So like that was my world. And then from college onwards, and I became just passionate about adventure sports, action sports, big nature, big oceans, mountains, those kinds of things, and guided all over from the Himalayas on Everest and Nepal and Tibet to the Sierras and the Rockies, and just loved sucking the marrow out of life, but also kept having these utterly non-ordinary, wild-ass experiences. And then I would sort of come home and I'd be like, what, for the love of God, was that? And that kind of began my inquiry into what I guess is best described as sort of neuroanthropology. Like you stumble across an experience, you're like, holy moly, nobody told me this was out there. And then you're like, well, where else has this happened, to whom? And what did they have to say or think about it? So you kind of find yourself studying the literature, and this is the wisdom traditions, this is science, this is mysticism, it's, all sorts of things for thousands of years. And you're like, oh, okay, this happened in 1500 in Italy. This happened in 2000 BC with the Hebrews. This happened here, there, and everywhere. And then you can start seeing a commonality or patterns. So you're like, okay, I'm not special, and this happens. And then the neuro part is, well, why does it happen? Like what's under the hood? Because in each time and place, we always have a cultural story, a sort of a mythology about these non-ordinary states, mystical experiences, transcendent insights, all that stuff. Like we're storytelling monkeys. So every single time we've told a story about these things. But when we balance it against the neuroscience, you're like, now I'm beginning to gain insights on the mechanisms of action, like why this thing happens, when it does, how it does. And once you kind of get that understanding, it's a little less mystical, it's a little less personal. You're sort of like, oh, this is part of the human experience. This is part of all of our birthrights. And then you can point that same understanding forwards, and it goes from neuroanthropology, looking into the past, to culture architecture, looking into the future. How do we create healthy, vibrant, positive expressions of this? And especially for today, right? Without the mythologies, without somebody yearning to have an experience that is arguably our shared birthright, without having to swallow someone else's fish story. So how can we kind of open source the tools and technologies so everyone can go see for themselves?
Yeah, and you do such a great job. I love in the book, you talk about three important meanings. We call it meaning 3.0 of the flywheel. You talk about ecstasis, catharsis, and communis. It's so brilliant because I think that's the fundamental formula for a culture that thrives. So can you talk a little bit about that for our audience?
Sure. And actually, in writing Stealing Fire 4 years ago, it was predominantly a story about the hidden or recently rediscovered power of having peak states. But then I noticed that in the book, I was like, but every argument I made is why this was worthwhile, why we ought to consider it, even though it's been controversial and filled with taboos, was almost exclusively because it either helps us heal and mend, or it helps us bond, connect, and cooperate. So I realized, actually, it's not just pointing out the value of climbing to the mountain top, it's the base of that peak as well. And one side is catharsis, the deep healing and integration,